Hello friends, good morning, good afternoon and good evening to all. Myself Akshay Kumar, YA Chair, ASHRAE Chandigarh Chapter. Welcome to this webinar jointly organized by ASHRAE Chandigarh Chapter, ASHRAE Rajasthan Chapter and ASHRAE Falcon Chapter. I am sure you all are aware about ASHRAE. ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating and Air Conditioning Engineers. This society has mission to serve humanity by advancing art and science of HVAC and R and their allied field. This society consists all the professional members related to HVAC and building industry. With the initiation taken by ASHRAE Chandigarh chapter to spread knowledge among the members. So during the period of lockdown, today is our 19th webinar on fundamentals of ASHRAE Standard 55. I want to just highlight about ASHRAE Standard 55, the thermal environmental conditions for human occupancy. This is an American national standard published by ASHRAE that establishes the ranges of indoor environmental conditions to achieve acceptable thermal comfort for occupants of building. It was first published in 1966 and since 2004 has been updated every 3 to 6 years. The most recent version of the standard was published in 2017. The purpose of the standard is to specify the combinations of indoor thermal environmental factors and personal factors that will produce thermal environmental conditions acceptable to a majority of the occupants within the space. So now, if you are ASHRAE members, then it's very good. If you are not, then be a part of ASHRAE by register yourself online at join.ashrae.org to keep in touch with all the activities done by ASHRAE Chandigarh chapter or any other regional chapters. Now, moving to ASHRAE Code of Ethics. In this and all other ASHRAE meetings, we will act with honesty, fairness, courtesy, competence, inclusiveness, and respect for others, which exemplify our core values of excellence, commitment, integrity, collaboration, volunteerism, and diversity, and shall avoid all real or perceived conflict on interests. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter, the ASHRAE Distribution Lecturer, Mr. Robert Bean. Mr. Robert Bean is a director of www.healthyheating.com and founder of Indoor Climate Consultant Inclusive. He is retired engineering technology professional as ASET and APEGA, who specialized in the design of indoor environments and high performance building systems. Mr. Bean is a third term ASHRAE Distinguished Lecturer, recipient of Low Flag Award, Distinguished Service Award, instructor for the ASHRAE Learning Institute. He has authored many papers, articles, and course curriculum and served on numerous technical committees related to indoor environmental quality building and energy system. His motto is design for people, good building follows. Now I want to do a small announcement. The recording of the webinar will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe our YouTube digital channel ASHRAE Chandigarh, and the question and answer will be done at the end of this session. You can ask your questions by typing in chat box and same will be answered at the end by speaker. Now I request to Mr. Bean, please present your presentation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies, and it's wonderful to have the honor to present this topic to you this morning. And it certainly is one of the most important subject matters that we face as a design community, architects, engineers, interior design professionals, as well as the trades and the developers and the builders. As a distinguished lecture program that ASHRAE brings to you, this is a great opportunity for those of us that have a lot of gray hair or no hair and to pass down the information that we have learned, many of us over decades and decades as practitioners And although I have studied a lot of this in the subject matter, both from human physiology and psychology point of view, at the end of the day, I am just a practitioner like everybody else, designing buildings and indoor environments when we were practicing. I'm retired now, but for the benefit of the occupant, always for the benefit of the occupant. So it was mentioned about ASHRAE and membership, and I would encourage all to join the organization. It's, you know, I think the world would be much better if it was run by engineers. And we have built over years, ASHRAE, along with affiliated organizations, a global network of people, of course, that are concerned with the built environment, and of course the people in the built environment, which is what today's presentation is all about. So it is just a fundamental course. We won't do a huge deep dive into it. We only have roughly 45 minutes, but at the end, what I want you to get out of this is just how important the fundamentals of the standard are in the design of buildings. And I say that meaning architecture, the enclosure design, also interior design, and then as well the mechanical systems as well. And so we'll introduce the basics of the standard, and then I'll also show you some compliance tools that we used in our own design practice to help us understand the space and also understand the client and of course their needs. So one of the things that's important for many, many years now, I think I started in 2002, if I remember correctly, asking people their knowledge of thermal comfort in the standard, and it was quite shocking to find that most professionals, most design professionals, weren't aware of the standard, and very few could actually perform a compliance test according to 55. And we would never, as an industry, any other industry, whether it was in the profession of medicine or accounting or law, where we would accept as a society such low illiteracy in such an important subject matter, and yet we seem to tolerate the illiteracy when it comes to thermal comfort. It's actually quite bizarre. I don't know why that happens, but you know, maybe we'll figure that out. So as it was mentioned, in 1966, the standard was introduced, and so in fact, it's been one of ASHRAE's oldest standards. And it should be also brought to everyone's attention that it doesn't stand alone. Certainly in Europe, the 12251 or ISO 7730 is almost in many ways a sister document, because the two of them together sort of evolved from similar researchers. And we of course have seen that also in Eurasia, so Australia, and then also in Asia as well. And so you'll see these standards exist. And then this really what brings us together as a global community is that we all have a common client, which is the occupant, and the standards have been developed by a global community of researchers. So it's a very, very important document. The purpose of the standard was already read to you, so we won't spend too much on this, but we are trying to satisfy the majority of the occupants. One of the most important statements out of this is this concept of condition of mind, and you're going to see why this is incredibly important as we get to sort of the mid part of the presentation. So first thing first, everybody, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, we all have very similar abilities to sense our environment. The physiology that we have is the same. And then we develop perceptions. And of course, our perceptions are based not only on our physiology that we share in common, but also our own personal experiences within the environments that we're in. And then of course, from that perception, we react, and we react at a below conscious level and an above conscious level. So when we get overheated, you know, we close the blinds, we remove clothing, we try to stay hydrated, we try to find an elevated airspeed, cool surfaces to be next to. And then of course, if we get cold, then of course we try to put on more clothes, increase the temperatures, try to find warmer radiant surfaces to be around. And so that is our reaction. But at a below conscious level, the body already is controlling blood flow to and from the surface of the skin as a means of regulating the temperature. And of course, this is done through regulation of hormones and our automatic and autonomic nervous system as it responds at a neurological level. And we won't get too much into the human physiology and psychology of it because this is more to do with the standard. But later on this week, we're going to talk about the physiology in another presentation, and you can find information of that online. One of the areas of debate has to do with the human body and the regulation of temperature. And it's quite interesting because even within ASHRAE's own library, there is a conflict between the numbers. But if you look at the medical textbooks, you look at the ASHRAE handbooks, if you look at the indoor environmental guidebooks, you will find that it will tell you that the dominant mechanism that the human regulates its temperature, sensing and releasing, is through radiation. And so this is why enclosure design is so important, because as practicing engineers and designers, we know that the differential temperature between two surfaces is going to be driven by the Stefan-Boltzmann constant and then also the emissivity and the delta T. So the surrounding surfaces around us, of course, are incredibly important. And it's only when you get into really high performance buildings or inside interior spaces where you see that the dry bulb temperature, the air temperature, and the mean radiant temperature can be oftentimes assumed to be the same. But if you approach the exterior of the architecture, and there's a lot of glass, and depending on what's happening in the outside world, that inside surface temperatures can get incredibly hot, or where I'm from, incredibly cold. And this will have a huge impact on our radiant experience in the space. So it's important that we understand that. As I mentioned, the neurological and the hormones in the body regulate the temperature, and it's a beautiful system. If you think about it, the body, you know, you don't need any batteries. You don't need to read a 27-page programmable thermostat manual that's usually written in like a number 7 font, very difficult to read. And so as long as we stay healthy, the body will do its own control to regulate the core temperature so that we are in a place of what we call homeostasis. And I would suggest for all of those online that you join us later on Thursday to learn a little bit more about this. We'll go into this in quite a bit of detail. If you can't join us, then I would suggest that you go online and just, you know, within a half hour or an hour of study, you will learn about the physiology and the psychology of thermal comfort as it relates to our own bodies and how we sense, perceive, and then respond at a below conscious level. One of the things that we see often all over the world is the tension that's created between what building codes require for thermal comfort and what people actually experience. And it's amazing that when you think about it, that the building codes for the most part establish the lowest requirement before there's a failure. So we would say in the education world that you can operate or design a building to a D grade, the lowest grade before failure. And that D grade says, okay, we should do load calculations, heating, cooling load calculations. We should take some air out, put some air in, and as long as the control device, typically a thermostat, can maintain 22, 24, 18 degrees, depending on what part of the world you're from, that you would be in compliance with the code, and that this is oftentimes interpreted as being a proxy for thermal comfort. But the reality is this: the people in the space experience much more dynamic environments. You have the sun shows up every day and it loads the building up with shortwave radiation, and of course some of that comes through the glass as shortwave radiation depending on the solar heat gain coefficient, and of course that energy is then absorbed and then re-released into the space as long wave radiation. We have the sunlight, again, shortwave radiation hitting the solid surfaces of the building, gets conducted through, warms up the inside surfaces. It also then gets released as long wave radiation. So you have shortwave radiation, long wave radiation. We have stratification due to buoyancy in the air systems. We have drafts as a result of all kinds of things like hot air hitting a cold surface, changing the density of the air, creating a flow of cool air across the floor. We have changes in humidity depending on where you are in the room. We have people doing different things, wearing different clothes. And so it's incredibly dynamic, the environment. And so this is reality where this is not. The building codes do not represent what people actually experience in a space, but ASHRAE 55 does, and this is what the standard is all about. And oftentimes people, particularly if you're new to it, can get intimidated by what is all going on, but the reality is that if we just sit still in a room and enjoy our sensory experience as a human, that we will experience all of the things that are in Standard 55. So though it might seem complicated, in reality, we each of us, wherever we are in the world, wherever building we are in or in outside world, we experience all of these elements. So the Standard 55 really defines those conditions. What is it, the conditions that we need to create so that we have a higher probability of people being comfortable as opposed to being uncomfortable? And this again is, a shock that we have seen such low illiteracy in the standard when that's in fact one of the most important ones that we have. So I'm really, really pleased to hear. I think we had something like over 1,300 registrants from your chapter efforts to bring people to this seminar. So congratulations on having so many people participate and learning about the standard. And now after this, that you can go and you can apply it to your own practices and for the benefit of your client. We know that that the Center for the Built Environment and other organizations around the world that have done research papers on post-occupancy surveys find that there's incredibly low compliance with thermal comfort standards. And when you think about 80% satisfaction to 90% satisfaction is the target rate, and yet really we're only hitting maybe 2, 3, 5, something like that, 8%. Not very impressive. In fact, if any other industry, if you think about the automobile industry, for example, had only 8% satisfaction with the products, it quickly would be out of business. And so these are the things that we need to address. We know what works and we know what doesn't work, and we're unfortunately right now in a state where we're developing lots of buildings that don't work when we know better. And part of that is us as a design community being educated and communicating what we know about people in buildings to the architectural community and the development community, and that of course is going to take time. I like to look at thermal comfort as a cake, and the ingredients of the cake are represented up here on your screen. It's funny again that we see a lot of parts of the world where they'll use air temperature, the temperature dry bulb, as a surrogate for thermal comfort. Well, if you were baking a cake, that would be like saying baking soda is a muffin. And it's only one ingredient. With thermal comfort, it's the same. You have lots of ingredients. And when you get the ingredients right, when the humidity is right and the air temperature and the mean radiant temperature is right, and you understand what they're doing and wearing in the space, and we control temperature stratification and floor temperatures and this asymmetry, that will have a much higher probability of people enjoying the space and not being stressed out by overheating and underheating. And this really ultimately comes down to what the objective of the standard is to reduce the stress level associated with thermal discomfort. And we know, the studies tell us that people get distracted by bad indoor environments. And in that distraction, they lose their productivity. They also lose their ability, in the case of education, to be able to focus on whatever learning is a requirement. Maybe it's an exam, maybe it's studying something, engineering, that these bad environments become a distraction, and they can lead to stress. And we know the stress at a residential level and even within office spaces can be high between colleagues as you develop these wars, these battles, which we'll talk about is not gender-based, by the way. It's more to do with the clothing than anything else. So these, in fact, are the ingredients, and we can actually summarize them in a table looking at the two personal factors. That is, what are people doing in the space and what are they wearing? And so we have what's called within the standard the representative occupant, and the representative occupant is the voice, if you will. It's the modeling voice that says, okay, I am this person in this space doing this activity, wearing these clothes, and I will represent all of the other people in the space in the same scenario. But if that changes, if the clothing changes, or if the person does something different, well, now then you have two situations to evaluate. We have the general environmental factors. These are applied in all assessments. Whenever you do a compliance to ASHRAE Standard 55, you have to look at these 4 conditions. So the air temperature, the mean radiant, which again is the surfaces around the person, how does that influence the radiant exchange from the occupant to these indoor surfaces, the humidity, of course, and the airspeed. And I should also point out that these values, when we do a compliance assessment, always relate to the person. So where the person goes, so goes their experience of the space. So when we talk about mean radiant temperature and dry bulb temperature, the 2 of them together, when you marry them, is called the operative temperature. This is in fact what people sense is the operative temperature, not dry bulb, not mean radiant, but the 2 of them together. So where the person goes, so goes the operative temperature. And because operative temperature includes MRT, where the person goes, so goes the MRT. And so this is what's really important. Typically, when we have a control device in the space, it's on the wall. It doesn't represent what the person is doing, what they're wearing, or where they're actually located in that environment. So very important to understand that. And then we know that when people do have a low activity, like if they're just sitting, for example, or lying down, reading a book, in some kind of a lounge chair, whatever, but very low activity and wearing very low clothing, that other factors come into play, like the stratification in the space, the radiant temperature, symmetry, floor temperature, ankle drafts and drafts. So these have to apply. So all of these together, I want you to see these as sort of the ingredients in the thermal comfort cake. And then when we get these things correct, then we have a much higher probability of having happier occupants. And that really was the study of Dr. Olaf Anger and all of his predecessors and his colleagues around the world. And of course, at his work at the Danish Technical University, they looked at, they said, well, if we get everything right, we get the architecture right, we get the enclosure design right, we get the interior design right, and the mechanical systems, that the probability of people voting on a scale from neutral to hot or neutral to cold, that they will vote mainly between the slightly cool and the slightly warm. And we say that's sort of the 0 plus or minus 0.5 on the predicted mean vote. And what they then did is tied the PMV to what's called the PPD, or the predicted percentage dissatisfied. And so we know that when we get everything correct, that those voting in the 0 to plus or minus 0.5, there will be a very low amount of people dissatisfied. But if we start to get any of the criteria incorrect, large mean radiant temperatures due to large window to wall ratios, poor fenestration performance, or thermal bridging in cold climates, all of these types of things, people will start to vote at a much more aggressive number. So they'll go from, say, neutral, slightly cool to cold, or up to warm or hot. And of course, these numbers then correlate to much more higher dissatisfied people. So we know from our own worlds of design and practice what buildings work, what buildings don't work, and we can actually make these predictions before we start excavation of the building. And this is important, that we have these discussions ahead of time with the client, not during construction, not after occupancy, but before the design. So clothing plays a big, big role, and we see this all over the world. The news people particularly want to make the thermostat war a gender issue, but it's not a gender issue at all. It has a lot to do with the clothing, and we can see in office spaces all over the world that when you take males and females in space together, oftentimes, depending on your culture, that the females will be wearing a little bit less clothing than the males. The males will be more formally attired, sometimes ties, jackets, these types of stuff. The women will be wearing dresses, skirts, blouses, these types of more lighter clothing. And it's the clothing that makes the big difference. There's some small physiological differences, but does not explain the discomfort or the tension that we see in office spaces or in homes around the world. That has more to do with the clothing than the gender differences. And this, of course, was, it's funny because every couple of years a research project will come out and it will support a statement about it being female versus male, physiology differences, preferences. But when you dive deep into the research, you will find that there's flawed research. For example, they may only have studied females and never had a male cohort study to balance that out. Or there'll be both genders brought into a research facility, but they won't be told to wear the same clothing. So they'll show up with their own personal preference of clothing. And then this research gets interpreted incorrectly as being a gender issue, when in fact it wasn't. And so you have to be very careful when you see these reports come out, and you have to be very, very critical of the news people covering these issues, because who wants to report that it's a clothing issue when it could be a gender issue, right? They're all in it for the publicity. That's what they're all about. So anyways, mean radiant temperature, ASHRAE standards, handbooks, they tell us that at low velocities that we typically find in buildings, that up to 60% of the sensible heat exchange is radiant. So we can't ignore that radiant element. It is in fact the dominant mechanism. So inside surface temperatures matter a lot. We have to be very, very aware of window to wall ratios and solar heat gain coefficients, and making sure that the structures that we build don't encourage lots of thermal bridging. So as we know, like the #1 rule in building science is what's on the outside wants in, what's on the inside wants out. And of course, on the outside is the sun, and that's a lot of energy that it can dump onto a building, 700, 800, 900 watts per square meter. That energy will want to get in the inside. And of course, that's going to affect the surface temperatures. So we have to be able to control that with proper architectural design, making sure that we try not to be so flamboyant that we can no longer control what happens inside the spaces. So this mean radiant temperature gets married to the dry bulb temperature, and you can then have what's called operative temperature. And operative temperature is in fact what the people sense. So it's very much, a balance. If the dry bulb goes down, the mean radiant temperature has to come up. If the MRT goes down, the dry bulb has to come up in order to maintain that operative temperature. So I simply have just taken 3 examples of 3 operative temperatures based on the relationship between dry bulb and mean radiant. And you can have this, obviously, when you download the slides, or you'll have the recording, and you can see how this works. So it's not, well, in the perfect world, the dry bulb would equal the mean radiant temperature, but that's only occurs in the interior spaces of buildings, or in really high performance enclosures where we have very low fluxes. And but in the real world, the sun, because it's dynamic, it's transit, it moves, then the temperature will also be dynamic and change. And so it's very ambiguous, people's experience in the space as a result of any radiant influence. If you can control the radiant influence, then of course you can make it very homogenous. It's not, you don't have these battles, but people like to see nice, beautiful views. And so we have these flaws, these weak points in the building. So until we get that fixed, we will see ambiguity within the thermal environment as long as we see it. And as examples, here we have this one building on the left-hand side is from Vancouver, the other one is from Calgary, and you can see that people are trying to control not only the sunlight, but of course the heat as well. And so that's the thing about light, is that it has both those functions, right? And we see the light but also heat, and these become very difficult in terms of thermal comfort. But that also creates other problems, like the destruction of interior finishes. If you want to destroy a synthetic carpet, for example, all you have to do is hit it with shortwave radiation. It turns into gases and particles. So now you have an indoor air quality problem. So you have a lighting problem, you have an air quality problem, and you have a thermal comfort problem, all because of overglazed architecture. And then also these are bad, or they're very good at transmitting sound. So when you have lots of glass, it's very difficult to control the sound. So you have sound problems. And so, we have to really challenge the architectural community globally, these styles. Is it really necessary to have these glass buildings? So this mean radiant temperature is really important, and operative temperature. This was a project in Calgary. It was a condominium project. This is the vestibule area. And just to put it into perspective, I was told today that in Dubai it was like 45 degrees Celsius. We never get to 45. On a good day in Calgary, we might get to 25 degrees Celsius. Like today, it will be like 17 or 18 degrees C. That's a nice day for us. If we can get to 25, it's a great day. But In the wintertime, you know, we designed for minus 35, minus 40 degrees Celsius, incredibly cold. You throw a cup of coffee in the air, it freezes and it crystallizes it before it hits the ground, very cold. And so we have architects here, like we have architects everywhere else, that want to use a lot of glass. There's no way we can provide comfort in these spaces. You can blow all the hot air into a room like this all day long, that glass temperature, even if it's a high performance glass, triple pane, triple sealed, argon filled, doesn't matter. The glass inside surface temperature at minus 40 degrees Celsius, it will be approaching, you know, somewhere around 8 degrees C, 10 degrees C, something like that. It's incredibly cold. So that's important. Also important is humidity. And for many, many reasons, we need to control humidity. Of course, that's a big discussion these days with COVID-19, is that maintaining, you know, this 40 to 60. I like personally to say 35 to 55, plus or minus 5%. It gives us some wiggle room. But this mid-range has been demonstrated in laboratories, research work, but also in projects, hospitals, that the virus transmission is much lower with these mid-range humidities. But you can see here that there's many reasons to control humidity, but also because of thermal comfort, and we'll show you some of that later on. So humidity, in terms of thermal comfort, it of course controls the vapor pressure in the room. And so if someone is overheating, if the vapor pressure on the skin is higher than the vapor pressure in the room, well, then the release of that moisture, the sweat, the perspiration, takes with it both the sensible and the latent heat, and then in that process we get cooling. But if the vapor pressure in the room is high because of the moisture content, then that gets suppressed, and then the body no longer can cool itself through evaporative cooling, and so it begins to overheat. So humidity control is important. And we know basically that when you start to get into the sort of the higher temperature ranges, that says 25, 26, 27, that the shift occurs where the body moves from radiant and convective cooling to more evaporative cooling. And of course, the evaporation cooling works provided the vapor pressure in the room is lower than the vapor pressure on the skin. So this is why we need to control humidity if we want to actually cool. The other thing is airspeed, and I'm going to play this animation. And this was actually in a room on a person's desk. We were actually doing some training. That's the formula that's there in the drawings. And this airflow, of course, can be comfortable for many people if the room is, of course, warm and humid. And if they're wearing lighter clothing, then this air velocity can provide some convective cooling from the space. But of course, in the wintertime where I'm from, this would not be comfortable at all. This would cause a tremendous amount of discomfort having these kinds of airspeed. So we want to make sure that when we talk about airspeed, it is in fact a good tool for thermal comfort. And on the screen there at the very top, you can see some different ranges there from 0.25 meters per second all the way up to 1.54 meters per second. And what that can cause in terms of discomfort and noise, and how we can compensate with these higher velocities by looking at the clothing value, for example. So as we wear more warmer clothing, heavier clothing, then we can tolerate much higher air speeds in the space. This becomes a bit of an issue for us, and one of it, certainly my current concern, has to do again with COVID-19, is that will the use of elevated air speeds cause an increase in the transmission indoor spaces of the virus? And we don't know this yet, and of course, but it's a question mark. Then we have what's called the radiant asymmetry. And radiant asymmetry is the experience that a person has when they're exposed with different surface temperatures on either side of them or above them. So warm ceiling, cold floor, warm wall, cold wall, you know. And so the body doesn't like it when the values are extreme. So let's take, for example, for someone that's in, say, in India, that maybe you have an office building with a very large window to wall ratio, and the occupant is close to that window. Quite possible that the inside surface temperature of that glass is very, very high. And if that building is air conditioned, then there will be a opposite temperature effect on the other side of the person. And so having the experience of having hot on one side and cold on the other causes discomfort. And the body does not like having such large changes. So we call that radiant asymmetry. And then we know that in low activities and low clothing, that floor temperatures have to be considered. And we know from the work that Bjarne Olsen and Fanger and other people did in their studies that we don't want floors if we're providing heating from a floor to exceed more than 29 or 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And from a cooling perspective, that we don't want to see temperatures lower than 19 degrees C or 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, the percentage of people will start to complain as a function of these temperatures. So here's some examples. This is, again, I am from a cold climate, so a lot of the pictures you're going to see are from my experience. So maybe you'll feel sorry for me. And when we get to minus 40, if you see that in the news, just send us some warm weather. Just send us lots of warm weather because we need it. But when it gets really cold outside, then you can have these cold walls. In this case, they're using glass block construction, and they're compensating for this discomfort with the radiant heating. But the radiant heating also provides that other extreme. So you see that you can imagine the radiant asymmetry that occurs in the space, and then but also the floor temperature. Now, this space that you're seeing here, though, is not a space that's occupied for more than 15 minutes. And the standard basically says if it's just a transitory space, like someone's walking through it, the standard does not apply. The person has to be in there for some period of time in order for the standard to apply. So even though you might have spaces like this that might have problems with radiant asymmetry, if no one's occupying this space, then okay, it's not a problem. We're just conditioning it. The person's going to walk through to wherever they're going, to another part of the building, such a thing. So okay, not a problem. But we see asymmetry when we get into, say, condominiums. And this is a place where there's large window to wall ratio. The fenestration is not the best. And that there might be, in this case, this is a heating mode where the outside's very cold, inside, and there you can feel asymmetry there. You'll also get draft in this case as well. And here's an example. This came out of the REBA handbook. I love this illustration because it looked at the temperature, interior paint temperatures with or without solar shading. And you can see that there's some incredibly intense temperatures on some of these inside surface temperatures, 40 degrees Celsius. That's a warm surface temperature to have to work next to in the summertime. So controlling that is important. And the stratification, again, the temperature between the ankles and the heads. And you should know right now that the standard is, we go through reviews and revisions of the standard on a regular basis. And one of the things that we are evaluating right now is that stratification number. We're considering allowing a much more aggressive difference compared to what the old document tells us, but it still needs to be considered. We know different types of heating systems create different temperature profiles, but this is also a function of the building. So when you get bad buildings, with air-based systems, that you're going to have a different stratification than if you have a really high performance building with another type of heating system. So the heating systems matter, the architecture matters, the mean radiant temperature matters. All of these will affect the stratification. And then of course the drafts, again, warm temperature hitting a cold surface, changing the density, having the air drop down. Same thing with cold hitting warm, changing the density, having it rise up. So you get this air movement as the temperature air, the mass of the air changes its density, and thus obviously its buoyancy. Here, it's underneath someone's desk in a very cold climate. Again, the thermostat could read 20 degrees or 22 degrees and be in compliance with the building code, but what the person experiences is something completely uncomfortable because of the flaws in the architecture and the enclosure design. Same thing with infiltration and exfiltration through building features like the doors, the seals around windows, electrical plates. All of these will create discomfort, even though the control device might be perfectly satisfied. And then we get people who will do whatever it takes to become comfortable in space, controlling drafts by taping up the diffusers in the ceiling. So, all right, so that's sort of the standard. We have the general factors, the local factors, the personal factors. These are the ingredients of the cake. When we get the architecture right, the enclosure right, the interior design mechanical, then we'll have a high probability that people will be comfortable, or a low probability that people will be uncomfortable. And of course, that is the objective. These metrics, of course, can be sensed with instrumentation. So we can write the specification, we can measure it, and we can determine whether we're in compliance with the standard or not. One thing I do want to talk about, there is in the world of thermal comfort discussion about these sort of stale environments, and in fact, are they good for occupants or not? And so the two terms, or the tension that's in this discussion, is between the term homeostasis, or the body's desire to be in a balanced state, and allostasia, which is the exercise that the body gets from a thermal point of view. In other words, people who are out walking in hot, high temperatures outside develop an overheated sensation, but then they go into the inside where it's cool and air conditioned, and that change becomes something that's perceived to be incredibly desirable. There's a wonderful feeling of having that going from really hot to really cold, and that exercises the body's response system. Well, this is defined by the word allostasia, and so our job as designers is to try to understand, well, what is good allostasia and what is bad allostasia, or in other words, degrees of stress. The body always wants to go back to its center point, and we push it off balance by giving it this experience, and some of that experience, in fact, is actually good for us. So that is the challenge. All right, so we're getting towards the end of the presentation. I want to go through some of the compliance tools. This is the ASHRAE Standard 55 and EN 15251 compliance tool. You can get this online through the Center for the Built Environment, or you can have access to it through the ASHRAE. When you buy the standard, you can get access to this. But you can see in the left-hand side the input values: air temperature, mean radiant, airspeed, all the way down to clothing. These are the input values. On the right-hand side is the output, and it will tell you whether you're in compliance with the standard or not. And then the psychometric chart there creates a comfort zone, and it will indicate where the person is in that comfort zone. So, and you can use the PMV, or the predicted mean vote, which is what we talked about, or you can choose the adaptive method, as you see here. And in this example, with this combination of ingredients, we are in compliance with the standard, and the person is in the comfort zone. We can change the clothing and then see what the impacts are by just selecting from the menu. We can also use a tool that allows us to build up our own clothing for the occupant, or there's a predictive tool as well. I can tell you, say at whatever time in the morning, 6 a.m., whatever the outdoor temperature is, that will then predict what people typically wear. And that has came about through some research work. But again, all of this, of course, in this particular example, in compliance with the standard. We can change the metabolic rate depending on what the people are doing in the space, or what they're, if it's a high activity level or a low activity level. We can change the relative humidity, and all of these, again, are just input values into the standard. The airspeed, of course, is what across the body, measured in 3 locations. And for the most part, it's very rare that you would have air speeds that would be uncomfortable if the systems are designed properly, like to an ADPI of 80 or something like that, 80%. It's very rare that you would ever have discomfort due to that. But in the wintertime, maybe you have drafts or some air velocities with cooler temperatures. Then in this case, there would be a problem, but generally not. Here we're showing operative temperature, which is the combination, again, as the mean radiant temperature in the dry bulb. And we can change that from operative temperature to actually the input values for air temp and mean radiant. So then there's the local discomfort assessments, and we mentioned this: the radiant asymmetry, the drafts, the vertical air temperature difference, and of course the floor surface ends. We can calculate these things, or we can make some reasonable estimates, judgment calls as practitioners, what these numbers could be, and it will tell us whether we're going to be in compliance or not with the standard based on the local discomfort. There's a feature on here which we love, which is the solar gain on calculation, solar gain on occupants, sorry. And it allows us to take a person and put them in a room and then look at the effect of shortwave radiation, looking at all of the input values that you see here. And these are described in detail in the publications from the Center for the Built Environment, also in the ASHRAE journal. There was a publication that was done discussing these, and then also in the standard itself, and then also in the online tool. So these input values will then tell us what the impacts are. So if you'll notice on the left-hand side where it says mean radiant temperature 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and I apologize that this is in IP units. Strangely enough, in Canada, although we're educated in the SI and we're taught to learn to use Celsius, when you get out of school, everything has now gone back to IP, which is really unfortunate. But 77 Fahrenheit is probably like 24 Celsius, 25 Celsius, something like this. And you can see that now if we look at the sunlight, direct shortwave radiation in this particular example, the offset creates like a 30-degree differential, and then ultimately, instead of the occupant sensing the 77 Fahrenheit, now they're sensing like 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So considerably impacted by the shortwave radiation, and by making this analysis, we'll then find that we're no longer in compliance with ASHRAE Standard 55. So it's incredibly powerful when you're sitting with an architect and the client and everybody else. If you're doing the design charrettes where everybody is sitting around the table with the design professionals, and then you can draw attention to, well, listen, you know, the beautiful design, the building's very attractive, but you have a lot of windows here, Miss Architect. And the client goes, yes, but we have a beautiful view of the ocean or the mountains or the prairies or whatever it is. And you can say, yes, it is a beautiful view, but if the sunlight comes through and this occupant is in this space and experiences that shortwave radiation, they will not be comfortable, and they will in fact close the blinds. And so the view that you paid millions and millions of dollars for, people won't be able to see it because they will be uncomfortable. And it makes for a very interesting meetings when you can demonstrate this in the meeting with everybody there at the table. So a lot of this is about preventing the discomfort in the design stage, not trying to solve it afterwards. And that's really what this is all about. So here's where relative humidity can be evaluated. We have a case here with these conditions. 60% relative humidity is not in compliance with the standard. A big part of that has to do with the metabolic rate, very larger metabolic rate, filing, standing, wearing some winter clothing in the space. That if we can drop the humidity down to 35% from 60 to 35, that we'll be in compliance with the standard. Now, this change in the humidity works for thermal comfort, but then you also have to ask yourself, well, there's an energy penalty associated with bringing the humidity down that low. And then now that what we know about virus transmissions, do we actually want to bring it down that low? So maybe taking it down to 35% is not where we want to be. Maybe we want to take it to 45, maybe 50%, but then shift something else in the space. Get better control over the mean radiant temperature, look at what they're wearing. Maybe we could change clothing policy, some other thing that can be done to make sure that we become compliant with the standard. The compliance tools will also do comparisons. So you can take 3 scenarios, which is very useful, again, when you're looking at design and saying, okay, well, there's these conditions, but what if we try these conditions, or maybe even try this other set of conditions, and what can we change in the ingredients so that we take that thermal comfort cake that we get compliance with the standard. The adaptive comfort standard, of course, is important, and so it's also part of it, and you can see when you're in compliance or not. This is looking at elevated air speeds. We can change the airspeed. There's tools like this one here. This is the CBE fan, so you can put ceiling fans in and look at the offset, the cooling offset that you get by elevated air speeds, and it will tell you that. So it's a very useful tool. Last, we're getting to the end of the presentation, and we'll open up for questions here, but 1383 was a research project available to ASHRAE members, allows you to do mean radiant temperature calculations, and it does these painted images telling you what the PPD or the PMV, depending on what you want to pick, MRT, as you move the person around the space. So a very, very useful tool as well. The more advanced version of that, which was released a few years ago, is RP 1766, also available to ASHRAE members. So this is my presentation, and my motto has always been design for people. Good buildings will follow. And when we use humans, the human physiology and human psychology as our base point for design. So in other words, we take the body and we design outwards so that we're serving the needs of the body, both from lighting, air quality, vibration, odor, sound, thermal comfort, air quality. When we use the body as the design metric, it will in fact tell us how the building should be designed. And so design for people and good buildings will follow. I want to encourage everybody to download the book. We released a book on thermal comfort. It is for cold climates, but the principles are the same, and there's some very good instructions on how to use the CBE thermal comfort tool as some other tools. It's free, and there's the link there, and so I would encourage you to download that. And that's it. I want to thank everybody for participating today, and so I'm going to turn it over to my hosts here for a question period.
Thank you, Robert, for this informative webinar. I received dozens of questions from the audience.
Very good.
I will start with the first question from Santosh. He's asking, is there any revision coming up for ASHRAE 55 2017, and when is it expected?
Yeah, so we'll meet again. Well, we're supposed to have met in Austin to vote on any changes, and so the standard is due for a revision. So if it doesn't happen this year, it will happen next year for sure. And it will include the ankle draft assessment. It will include the changes to the stratification and anything else that comes up in the committee will be included in that. So keep your eyes open for that. But it's a good question from another perspective, and that is that when you use the CBE tool, the Center for the Built Environment tool, which does the compliance test for ASHRAE 55, and that was the slides that I was showing, that you should know that the ASHRAE version of that comes with the ASHRAE Standard or accessible with the ASHRAE Standard, the ASHRAE version will always represent the most current state of the standard, where the CBE tool may include other elements that might be a little bit ahead of the standard. So just be aware of that.
Yes, and I just want to confirm also, because people are asking, CBE tool is for free, so you can use it whenever you want to use.
Correct.
Another question from Praveen. How do we determine the mean radiant temperature MRT? And
Okay.
how do we determine the MRT, and how do we make this in account while doing heat load calculations and making a set point in thermostat?
So there's three sort of ways of calculating the MRT, each being a little bit more accurate than the previous one. So the most simple way of doing it is doing a weighted average. It's actually not a true MRT, because MRT always relates to where the person is. So a proxy for that is to just do a weighted average. So you take the surface temperature times area, and you do that for all of the surfaces in the room. And then, of course, divide that by the total surface of the room, and you'll get a temperature which represents the average temperature in the space. So that is the simplest. It works for simple geometries with conservative architecture, very conservative window-to-wall ratios, very low fluxes. But it wouldn't work, say, for complex or flamboyant architecture. In these cases, then you should use the angle factor method, which Dr. Fanger developed and is described in his book, Thermal Comfort. But this method is available. It's in the ASHRAE Thermal Comfort tool. It's also in the two research projects, 1383 and 1766, I think it is. And also through the CBE, they also have an MRT calculator there as well. And the big thing for all of that is the tools themselves are actually quite easy to use. The input values you have to physically calculate, the surface temperature. So that you can get the formulas from the ASHRAE handbooks on that calculation. And by the way, we will be covering that again this week and next Thursday in a little bit more detail for one of the vendors, but you can find that online through LinkedIn. I think it'll be advertised there. So that's how you do it. And then there's another way, which is the plane radiant temperature method, which is also described in the ASHRAE handbook. So you can do the surface temperature, do area weighted, do plane radiant, or do the angle factor method, and those values will then determine the MRT. That then gets incorporated with the air temperature to determine the operative temperature. Now, there are very few vendors at this point that actually make an operative thermostat. Although they are out there, you have to search for them. We can't use brand names in the presentation, but you can find them. And I would also suggest that if you have difficulty finding an MRT or an operative thermostat, that you can actually create your own measurements by placing sensors in the surfaces and then doing the averages on the signal outputs, and then marrying that surface temperature average to a dry bulb sensor, and then that will give you an operative temperature surrogate.
Okay, another question from Alwinson Matthew. He's asking for the slide that showed the desired airspeed velocities. What standard is based on?
Oh, so again, so within ASHRAE Standard 55, there is a whole section on airspeeds. And so it looks at what is the person wearing, what are they doing, and what is the dry bulb temperature. And so it's actually a combination of those four elements that you can actually manipulate the airspeed. So as the person increases their metabolic rate by doing more higher level activity, less clothing, warmer air temperature, you can increase the airspeed. So the standard actually will do that. And there's in fact a switch within the thermal comfort tool where it'll say occupant controlled airspeed. And this switch in the software tool will then evaluate airspeed when it's controlled by the occupant. And so this is a very useful tool actually. And in fact, we know there are many climate zones around the world where we don't need to use refrigerant-based air conditioning systems, which are of course very energy intensive. If we can allow people to wear less clothing, if it's a humid climate, if we can reduce the humidity by using in-space dehumidifiers, and then elevate the air speed, that we can provide conditions for thermal comfort without having refrigerant-based cooling systems. So, yeah. So next, let's hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Kaveh Azimi. He's asking, in ISO 7730, you can raise the floor temperature up to 31 centigrade. What do you think? Especially in radiant heating design, can we raise the floor temperature up to 31 centigrade?
Yeah, so the difference between 7730 and standard 55 is that the 7730 has a classification system, grades of the PMV, if you will, and where standard 55 does not have that. So the standard 55 is a little bit more restricted in that sense. There are cases where you can certainly elevate the air or the floor surface temperature at the perimeter, for example, of buildings. So if you have a high heating load and you need to get that surface temperature up to condition the space, also perfectly acceptable to have such high temperatures in saunas, bathrooms, change rooms, indoor swimming pools, around the pool deck, anywhere where people have a very, very low clothing value, where they're in contact with the floor, with the skin of their feet, for example. These types of temperatures are acceptable. But you have to be very careful with floor temperatures because there have been in very, very rare instances, I think maybe one every 80 years or so, we see something where somebody will have a floor heating system that's unregulated. And this happened actually in France for many years, where they had unregulated floor temperatures and people ended up with circulatory problems, thrombosis, as a result of such high temperatures. So we don't want to have that happen. But there is also the potential that, let's just say, for example, that somebody has a small infant in a bassinet and they're clothed, and that person is unaware of such high temperatures on the floor and places the baby on the floor. Then, of course, this infant has no way of communicating that they're overheating and they're already clothed. There could be some health issues there. So there are cases where you can have the high temperatures, but we need to control them properly. So limit controls is very important in this case. So thank you for the question.
A question from Mohammed Abdul Wahab. Is there a thermostat that can measure operative temperature?
So we mentioned that earlier. So there are manufacturers that do make an operative thermostat, but again, because it's an ASHRAE presentation, we are not allowed to use brand names, but
Yes.
you can go onto the internet and you can search for operative thermostats, and it will be one of the big international manufacturers that will make that. But keep in mind again that when you have really good architecture with really good enclosure design, that it's often not necessary to have the operative thermostat. The operative thermostat is very useful when you have large influences, radiant influences, and then we need to be able to sense what people are sensing in the space, the radiant relationship. So very important, but if we can fix the enclosure with more conservative architecture, better enclosure design, then it's not often that we need to have an operative thermostat. So just keep that in mind. The reality is, in fact, if you think about it, and I think Dr. Olsen from the Danish Technical University, this is going back, I think something like 10, 15 years ago, and he was talking about this very subject matter, that the operative temperature thermostat actually is very useful more useful actually for air-based systems than radiant-based systems, because the air systems tend to have, well, they don't address the radiant component, and so having the operative temperature thermostat actually serves the air-based systems actually much better than a radiant-based system. So it's worth studying Dr. Olsen's work. There's very few people in the world that has his level of understanding of human physiology and psychology and architecture and the use of radiant-based HVAC systems.
Okay, another question from Seth Willig. Is the basic notion of comfort and stasis flawed? How long is an occupant comfortable at any condition before they want to just change something for psychological or cultural reasons?
So that's a very good question, and I don't have a specific answer for you. We do know that we want to be very careful to understand that the ASHRAE Standard 55 has incredible flexibility built into it, as does 7730, and also the Chinese standards and other standards around the world. Oftentimes the standard gets, tagged that it's too restrictive, but there's no upper and lower limit of humidity. You can change the dry bulb temperature, mean radiant temperatures, 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees. You're allowed to have changes in the operative temperature in the space during the day, 6, 7 degrees, the whole temperature inside the space can change. So lots of flexibility. So when you have somebody in a space that might be a certain condition that they enter the space, they find it incredibly comfortable, but then after a period of time, the desire to have a change is triggered at a psychological level, and so they might want to open a window, for example, let some fresh air come in, or they will be able to, if they can, use more personalized control systems like desk fans, for example, or ceiling fans. So all environments should have these flexibilities built into it, so that in the event that a person becomes not satisfied due to a stagnant environment, like their own psychological perception is that, I would like to see a change, that these devices exist so that they can change. It's all about adapting, really, what it comes down to. So thank you for that question.
Okay. Last question from Shailin Verma. ASHRAE 60.1 now allows for relative humidity of 65%. How does that affect comfort levels as per ASHRAE 55?
So again, that is going to affect the vapor pressure in the room. 65, although it's starting to get up there, it's still not hugely aggressive. It's not like 85 or 90%. So I would not want to see numbers higher than that. And again, so if you go back to the ASHRAE Standard 55 and you use the CBE tool, you'll see that when the thermal comfort zone shifts to the left of the curve due to a lowering of the operative temperature, that changing that humidity up and down will shift the PPD and the PMV in the standard. So you can play. I would encourage you to play around with that, and you'll see that there's a range. It's not a specific number. So you can get to 60, 65, or 70%. So there's no upper limit in the terms of the thermal comfort, although there may be an upper limit for air quality. Some of that comes from some of the work that I think it was Tofton also from Denmark, and his colleagues looked at the perception, thermal comfort and perception of air quality is a function of humidity. So again, we know that the low PPD, low predicted percentage dissatisfied, occurs within this mid-range of dry bulb temperature or operative temperature, 20, well, let's just say 20 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius, in that 40 to 60% relative humidity. This zone is where you have the least amount of people dissatisfied. But as you shift the humidity up or down, or move the operative temperature up or down, that you'll also increase the amount of people dissatisfied. That will also show up in the CBE tool or the ASHRAE tool. You can see that for yourself. So thank you for that question.
Okay, I apologize from the audience because I still have more than 50 questions and we are running out of the time. Robert, can I forward these questions to you and you can answer these questions directly to the askers?
Yes, I will do that. But a little caveat. So this 6 weeks period of right now, I'm doing like 16 different webinars. So you can imagine 60 webinars with 50 questions. I have a lot of questions to answer. So my promise to you is if you send me the questions, I will do my very, very best to answer them, but it may not happen for several weeks, okay? And I just apologize because I have so many to answer, so.
Thank you and appreciate it. Okay, I think my colleague Shailendra now, if you want to end the webinar. And thank you, Robert.
Thank you, I appreciate that, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Osama. I'm Shailendra Kasera on behalf of ASHRAE Rajasthan Chapter, Chandigarh Chapter, and Falcon Chapter. Extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Mr. Robert Bean for delivering the excellent webinar on human thermal comfort and took out valuable time of your busy schedule. I would like thanks to all the participants for patient learning. Today, around 600 participants attended and benefited. I express my gratitude to Mani Khanna, Akshay Kumar, and Osama Kyata for planning the event in a desired way. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Mr. Rishabh Kasliwal, President, ASHRAE Rajasthan Chapter, Mr. Hassan Yunus, President, ASHRAE Falcon Chapter, and Mr. Amardeep Singh, President, Chandigarh Chapter, for supporting us. Once again, thanks to all participants and speaker. Over to Akshay.
Okay. Thank you, Shailendra sir. Thank you, Robert sir, for your very good presentation. Thank you, Falcon Chapter. Thank you, Rajasthan Chapter. And thank you all for your participation today. We are so grateful for your support. Without you, this would not be possible. Keep participating and learning with ASHRAE Chandigarh Chapter. Our next webinar is on 30th May 2020 at 6 p.m. The topic of next webinar is impact of climate change and urbanization on future building performance. The speaker for the next webinar will be Dr. Dhruv Prole. He is also a ASHRAE DL. And the recording of this webinar will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe our digital channel ASHRAE Chandigarh for more videos and for latest updates. And this is the calendar for our upcoming webinar, which is organized by ASHRAE Chandigarh Chapter. Our next webinar on 30th May, and then next 6th June, and next 20 June. And thank you all. Be safe and connected with us. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.